during COVID. So this is going to be, as I said, so a discussion between our two amazing speakers, and we'll have a chance for people to ask their questions in the chat. So whenever you have any questions, just pop it in the chat, and then we'll answer them in a Q&A session. So that's going to be in like 15 to 20 minutes roughly. So my name is Emma. I'm the Vice President for the Sustainable Development Association. And what we usually do is try to educate and promote sustainability and discussions around it. And also talk a lot more about justice and climate justice, which is quite an important topic. And we also are in collaboration with the Food Security and Sustainable Society and UNIFEF on campus. So that's all at Edinburgh University. And so today we have our two panelists. So there's Satvat Rehman. So she's the Chief Executive of One Parent Family Scotland. And so OPFS is a leading charity working with single parent families in Scotland, and they provide expert advice, practical support, and they campaign with parents to make their voices heard to change the systems, policies, and attitudes that usually disadvantage single parent families. She has more than 30 years of experience, which is kind of crazy, in the voluntary and public sector in Scotland and England. And she has worked in the fields of equalities, education, employability, economic development and regeneration, and early years and childcare. It's a mouthful, but it's quite impressive. And then she's been also since 2011 a member of several commissions, and advisory group. So she's a member of the First Minister's National Advisory Council on Women and Girls and the Scottish Government's Social Renewal Advisory Board. She's also on the boards of Child Poverty Action Group UK, Children in Scotland, and Families Outside. And she now lives in Edinburgh with her partner and two children aged 19 and 16. And we'll get a chance to know more about what you do a little bit later on. So our second panelist is Tuimushe Mushaka, and so she's the Senior Fieldwork Development Officer at the Poverty Alliance, and she's been working there since 2008, and her main role is working with grassroots, community-based organization, and people with direct experience of poverty and getting their voices heard in policy and decision-making at national and local levels. And she coordinates the work of community activist advisory groups, ensuring participation of people with lived experiences at different levels of the Poverty Alliance's work. And she also works with other team members in delivering a lot of training around poverty awareness and direct engagement with frontline professionals on issues like poverty and social exclusion. And she's spoken on a range of topics before on poverty, disability, refugees, and migrants, as well as gender-related issues at national and international levels. So we're really grateful that you guys are here and have taken the time to speak to us today and answer a lot of our questions. And so I guess you can also have a go at presenting yourself and how you've come to do the job that you're doing today. Maybe we can start with Satvat.
Thank you very, very much for inviting me along here today. I was particularly keen to come for a number of reasons, but one that my daughter has just started university, not at Edinburgh, she's at St Andrews, and sustainable development is one of the subjects that she's doing. So I was thinking, she doesn't want me to go and talk up there, so I'd love to come and talk somewhere else about it. So thank you very much. I must also say that actually my earliest experiences of getting involved in justice campaigns was as a volunteer, mainly around racial justice here in Scotland and also in England, and then looking at the various ways that the state itself is a perpetrator of violence against certain communities. So that was my starting point of activism. And from there, I just ended up going into various things. The last of which is working here for One Parent Family Scotland. And I think one of the things in terms of what we're here to talk about today, it's really important for me, certainly to get across, is the structural nature of the issues that we're dealing with and the structural causes of food insecurity, in Scotland. And the way that what we've had as a result of the pandemic has been something that shone a light on the existing inequalities that we have and the unequal access that there is in society to some of the basics, the fundamentals, in terms of what we expect to see. And certainly it's not as a result of there not being enough. We have more than enough, we have too much. But it's not, it's unequal in the way that it's distributed across society. And that's what we really see with the families that we work with. And I did just want to if it's okay, just give you a bit of a background and profile to single parents in Scotland, because that helps set the context really for what we're going to be discussing. Interestingly, one of the facts was that I looked at some national records of Scotland data, and the percentage of families with children in Scotland headed by a single parent increased from 6.4% in 1981 to 24.5% in 2014. But what we haven't seen is anything like the same recognition or understanding of the different dynamics and structures we have within families at the moment. We're still very much basing everything around a sort of two-adult model of families. In terms of food security, I mean, what we argue is that we can look at food poverty, we can look at fuel poverty, we can look at a whole range of different types of poverties, but fundamentally what we're talking about is just poverty, lack of income, lack of money. And that's what we see as being at the root of much of what we do. So in terms of the number of children in Scotland that live in poverty, in relative poverty, it's approximately 230,000. Of those 90,000, that's 39% live in a one-parent family. And it's the same in terms of absolute poverty and material deprivation and persistent poverty. The number of children living in single-parent households is disproportionate as a percentage of those. And it's not because of some of the stereotypes and the stigmatized attitudes and views that you hear about one-parent families or about single parents. But 90% of single parents are women. So there's just one potential earner in the family. The hourly earnings are likely to be lower because of the gender pay gap. The earner is limited in the hours they can work because of caring responsibilities. And there's a range of structural barriers that trap these families in poverty in terms of the way we structure work, the way we structure benefits, the way we even structure our childcare, all those things. And I think in terms of what we're here to talk about today, one of the things that I found really stark when you think about statistics was compared to a couple household with children, a single parent household with children spends a greater percentage of their budget on those household essentials, groceries, housing costs, heating, lighting, household goods, toiletries, insurance. They spend 52% compared with the 43%. And there's a very good report published by Public Health Scotland recently, which has all this data and the references in it. And this isn't, so they have good day-to-day money management skills to control spending, but it's become harder and harder for single parents to meet any minimum income standard. So food insecurity and financial insecurity are higher among single parent households. And in 2017, more than 1 in every 8 single parent households in Scotland reported they'd run out of food in the last 12 months because of a lack of money. And 1 in 6 reported that they couldn't manage well financially because there simply wasn't enough money. So this is the backdrop. And then we have COVID hitting us, right? And the pandemic hitting us in March. So you're already looking at inequalities that are there, which are then deepened as a result of the COVID pandemic. And it posed a unique challenge for single parents and their children because there was only the one adult, potentially only one income, and locked in and locked down. And some of the biggest worries that we heard about was worried about food and how to get help and the impact that would have on their children's education, social development, and mental health. We saw a 300% increase in calls to our helpline during this time, primarily about how am I going to be able to sort the basics, you know? And actually, the way we responded didn't help that at all. And that's one of the things I mean about structurally, the way in which we respond and the difference that it makes. Schools closed. So for many families, that was the end of access to free school meals. 32 local authorities in Scotland put together 32 ways of providing that support. And in some cases, they were provided in ways which actively stopped families from being able to get the food they needed. You know, some schools did it so that the family had to turn up at a set time of the day to pick up the packed lunches. It doesn't always work if you've got more than one child, or if you've got a child with additional needs or any of those things. Others decided that they were going to give vouchers for certain shops only. Glasgow decided it was farm foods, irrespective of whether or not there was a farm foods nearby, or how you had to get there and the cost of transport to get there, or whether actually it was a good place to go for that family, you know. And so what they were doing was taking away agency, choice, and the responsibility to be able to make your own decisions about what's best for your family. And one of the things nobody thinks about is actually one of the things that one of the parents I worked with said was that she lives with her 2 children. Her next door neighbour's a single parent. And what they would do is they would alternate cooking at each other's houses to save on fuel costs, you know. So associated with food insecurity are a series of other things that we need to think about. But overwhelmingly, what parents were contacting us about was how all this was affecting their children. Yeah. And when asked about what the effect is on children of food insecurity or lack of food, the first thing is the immediate stuff about hunger. And actually what we found was that many of the parents we work with were going without at all in order to ensure that their children had something to eat. Then, as we know, there's the impact on performance, on attainment, on attention, on all those things that support good outcomes. And then there's the longer term thing about trauma. How does it leave you feeling? Do you know, if you go hungry and you don't know where your next meal is coming from, it triggers certain responses in you. Yeah, and the neuroscience shows that now. So what we're looking at is a whole series of things which might impact on how that child is going to behave when they're older. You know, in terms of wanting to make sure they have enough food, all those responses that happen. And so what we did was we had structural inequality in the first place. There is a lack of adequate income and a minimum income standard that we have in this country, which would really support families to have that agency and that choice. It was exacerbated by COVID-19 and the pandemic and the measures that were taken from a health perspective that needed to be taken. And it's resulted in a whole series of crises for the families we work with. Now, the last thing I'm going to say is that I do think there's been some learning from it in Scotland, you know, which is why if you looked at some of the announcements that have been made recently, it's recognised the importance of a cash-first approach, where families get to make their own decisions about, you know, how they buy their food, what they buy, etc., those sorts of things, as opposed to it being prescribed for them. And we welcomed the Scottish Child Payment being rolled out for £10 per child under 6 to be paid by the end of February, in a recognition that there's an immediate need for money. So the winter payments that have been announced by Nicola Sturgeon over the weekend, the universal free school meals for all primary school children, which they're going to make a manifesto claim, and which is going to be all year round. And they're going to look at the cash first approach when the children aren't in school. So there's a whole series of things that we've learned as a result of this, which should improve the situation going forward. But I think in terms of food security and the fact that so many of the families we've worked with have had to rely on food parcels and food banks, whilst that might be an immediate crisis response, which we had to do, it shouldn't be the response to food insecurity in this country. And we should be looking at a more sustainable way that supports families, as opposed to it being this crisis way, and this way which makes them feel that in some way they're inadequate or to blame for the situation they found themselves in. I'll stop there because I can go on forever otherwise.
Yeah, no, thank you for this. It's quite important, like you said, that to highlight structural inequalities. I think it's the root of a lot of issues. Is there anything you'd like to add, Tomoshi, regarding structural inequalities, maybe from your point of view, and how you've seen it working with the Poverty Alliance?
Thank you so much for having me tonight. Satwat and I work together in the voices that we put across. In many ways, it's a privilege to be able to share the panel with her, because in a way, we speak to one voice. But one of the things that perhaps, in addition to what Satwat has said, is to strengthen the reason why people find themselves unable to put food on the table, and to say that this is not because of the behavior problem of the parent, but rather about the structural issues that Satwat has eloquently itemized. I also want to say that the impact of that in terms of mental health of not only the parents, but the children, the stigma that is out there in the community when people are not able to feed themselves and have to be reduced to going to food bank, has long-term impacts on everyone that is affected by that. I think it's also fair to say that food poverty is a manifestation of a policy failure. Our social security system has been so inadequate for a long time. You know, Satwat and I and others have made so much noise about the inadequacy of our social security system, but this is not reaching the people that have the gift to change that, to be able to understand that in the end it's causing more damage to the people. So unless we have the social security system fixed, giving people the minimum income that Satwat is talking about, minimum income standards, you know, avoiding the delays that are forcing people into debt, and you know, and never being able to get out of that, then we are going to continue to having a situation like that. I know that the whole question of food poverty in the UK became so real following the austerity agenda after the financial crash in 2008. And at the same time, you know, there was calls for the community, for the good society agenda to try and respond to some of the issues that were common at that time. And I think we have to applaud the community resilience that has been, you know, visually, you know, exemplary across the country in being able to keep communities and households fed, whether it was through a food parcel or whether it was through going to a soup kitchen, so that people do not necessarily die of hunger. But that is not a permanent solution to the problem. This is where we need to emphasize that. The other one, I remember that we were saying that food banks should be a short-term emergency measure, but now it has become part and parcel of the social fabric that we work with. And God knows when we are going to see a situation where we no longer have the need for food bank, until those structural issues such as low pay, for example, being addressed, because it's not the question of worklessness. It's the question of all those people who work so hard, but still don't earn enough money to be able to put food on the table after they've met their housing cost and all other needs. So as I say, you know, food poverty is a manifestation of a policy failure, a structural issue, and we need to try and do more in terms of shifting that balance and having the resources that we have in the country, which are massive. The gap between the rich and the poor, have even increased in these pandemic times. If you hear how much the Amazon guys earn in a second, how many people would that money feed? So it's a structural systemic issue that will need to change. And I'm afraid that is going to take a long time. And the other thing that Sata talked about is about the holiday hunger issue. And we as an organization and the communities we work with applaud the initiative the Scottish government is actually putting across this. And we'll continue to say that while we say, yes, that's a positive step forward, we still need to continue to critique those initiatives so that the issues that come as a result of those initiatives can be addressed. I'll give you an example. The Scottish child payment has been announced. Parents have been given information about applying. The Best Start grant has been announced. Parents have been encouraged who are eligible to apply for that. But there are families living in Scotland that are not eligible even for those interventions. I speak on behalf of people that I work with no recourse to public funds, who only hear about these interventions and ask themselves, why are our children not entitled to that support? I speak to groups that work with asylum seekers and refugees who say because the system has alienated them from the system entitlement, they can only hear about these interventions and they are never allowed to access that. And call upon government to say, for the children that are growing up on Scottish soil, would there be an opportunity for government to say, yes, let's support these children in some shape or form, even though that the national policy says you are not yet eligible because of the immigration control. So I'll end there and perhaps ask for any question that people might want us to respond to. And as I said, obviously, community resilience has been very strong. Community food networks have been there, emphasis on community gardens so that people can begin to grow their own has been also emphasized upon. But again, as we say, without those are good, but without a systemic change, we'll continue to be in the same place. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really a useful insight. I had a question expanding on that. Do you think, because you talked a lot about obviously not earning enough, and especially from a one-parent perspective, obviously the earning is cut down. Do you think increases in wages are the only solution, or things, especially right now with COVID, like universal credit, are also like an alternative as well, or an additional help?
I would see it as three things. One, we need to look at how we can increase income from social security. So that is universal credit being the main working age benefit. And actually, there was extra money put in there. It was £20 a week. And there's a big campaign at the moment to make sure that to try to keep that, because I think it has made a difference in terms of keeping some families just above the poverty line, not necessarily thriving, but not falling below the poverty line as well. I also think we can do more with the powers we have in Scotland to look to see how we can provide more for social security. I do think good work and fair work is important. I think it's critical as we come out of this, the sort of, I suppose, the health bit of the pandemic, because I think the economic shocks are going to be felt for quite a long time. But we do need to think about how we can have the living wage as a floor, the minimum we would expect anyone to earn. And also living hours, because you can be earning the living wage but not have enough hours to actually end up with an adequate income. So we have to look to see how we make work fairer and better. And then we have to look at how we reduce household costs. And there are some big costs families have. Housing is a big cost. Childcare is an enormous cost. if you are working and you've got children of the age that require childcare. Transport, when I was on the Fair of Fife Commission and we visited some of the groups in Fife, and I was talking to someone there who was saying actually the cost of public transport is so high in an area like Fife, and Fife's semi-rural, it's not all rural, you know, so you're not talking about one of the rural areas, that actually he was reckoning about 50% of what he earned every day was going on his travel costs. So there's a whole series of things that I think are interrelated, but I do think having a social security system which provides you with a security net, you know, the safety net we'd all want if we found ourselves in that situation, so that it's adequate and it's not pushing you into poverty or keeping you in poverty and pushing you further into debt, would have to be one of the fundamental tenets that we look at.
If I may add on to that as well,
Please go ahead.
Security. For example, while we acknowledge the £20 increase on universal credit, people who are on legacy benefit never got anything by way of a response to that social security. Also, there is an interaction with that increase with the benefit cap, for example. So if you have that and you are affected by the benefit cap, that money is grown back anyway, so you don't benefit from that increase at all. I have worked with families who have been crying that they got that increase, but then the cost, because of the benefit cap, meant that they actually didn't get anything in real terms. Also, I think the challenge around child poverty related issues is the 2-child limit, which is an unfortunate policy that government put in place. And at the end of the day, when a parent has children, they want to feed all of them. You cannot tell them to feed only 2 and keep the others hungry. So the logic behind that really is one that has been fundamentally flawed. And if there could be a massive campaign to shift the benefit cap, to shift the 2-child limit, and also make an equitable increase to all the social security benefits, that would be something that would be helpful. I know Satwat has talked about the living wage, but you know, the living wage assumes that each and every one of us is able to work. Yes, we agree that work is the best route out of poverty, but there are so many people who are not able to work because of a number of a variety of reasons, whether it's lack of childcare, whether it's the skills set that may not match the available employment opportunities, whether it's ill health and disability, and this is where the social security system as a safety net is important, that is made available to those people that are not able to work. The pandemic has decimated the number of jobs available now. Not many companies are hiring. In fact, the companies that we are employing are now collapsing. You heard of the news about the Arcadia empire going down and going with it with 13,000 employees. And you can imagine that within those, they have families behind them. They have a network of people that depend on that income. And so it's really looking at the economy and investing in areas that are supposed to give us more activity. You know, people have talked about investment in green jobs, more investment in the construction sector, because that way we can create more jobs. At the moment, even the jobs for the people who want to work, the jobs are basically not there. It takes us back to square one in many ways.
Yeah, that's quite a bleak picture. That is a reality today, I guess. I was wondering if you could speak more about, obviously you've talked about access to food and quantity and having enough food on the table, but I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about maybe food quality as well and access to good food, because I know you've talked about people having community gardens and that like kind of popping up everywhere. And what do you see as the future of like good quality, and what ways can we do to achieve that, I guess?
Okay. I think from what we've been hearing from the communities, obviously, when you are in that desperate position, whatever food that is on offer is what you take. You have absolutely no choice. But there have been issues that have been raised about the quality of the food, whether it was nutritious enough to keep families healthy. And then there were issues raised around religious implications of having to rely on food bank. For example, we spoke to families who were fasting during Ramadan. And when you come out of Ramadan and it's time to eat, you cannot simply have a tin of soup as your main meal. That's absolutely nonsensical. Also, it's about understanding the cultural implications of some of the food. You know, as an African, I grew up on food that I like most, that I can get because there are shops that sell that food. But when you are in that situation, the food bank is not going to have my cassava from Uganda or green banana that I enjoy so much because that's my food. So it's about making sure that the sensitivities around that vulnerability and access are addressed, whether it's halal food, whether it's cultural sensitive food, and whether it's the quality of the food, regardless of who the consumer is. The other thing that people talked about is about the food wastage that is still massive in this country. I mean, honestly, you just need to go to, I no longer go to buy any food at a prime time. I go around 7 o'clock and get things that have been reduced and they're still fresh to eat. But if you don't buy them, it means they end up in the bin. So we have to find creative ways of preserving the available food and avoid food wastage. And I don't think there's been any systematic approach on how we can, you know, maximize the food that we have and not waste it simply because people can't afford to buy it. But as I said, you know, the community gardens are still at a very small scale. It's really a tiny drop in the ocean. We are not at a stage where that is going to be sufficient enough to feed a whole family. So those initiatives are seen as soft outcomes in many ways, in the sense that they help to get people outside the home and are seen to do something, you know, perhaps for tackling social isolation, for connecting with their neighbors around a community garden activity. But it's not a massive food production initiative, if you see where I'm coming from.
Can I just add a couple of things to that? Because I think everything to which you said there, I agree with. I mean, a couple of the other things has been, for the families we work with, has been what's actually available locally. And that's been a big issue. We have services in Falkirk, so in the middle of a series of small villages. And actually, it costs a fortune to get anywhere where you can do a decent shop. So you rely on your local shop and what's available there. And what's available there is almost like the lowest common denominator in terms of the cheapest types of things you can get, probably with the least nourishment. And there is also something about how much it costs for some of the sort of better quality foods and more sustainable foods and things like that, you know. I mean, not far from where I live here in Edinburgh, there's a place where you can go with your own pots and pans or jars and get things filled up and stuff like that. So on the one level, you're saving a lot on packaging and all the rest of it. Actually, it's really expensive. You know, I've got the privilege to be able to afford to do that. For a lot of the families we work with, that simply isn't the case. So I think there is a whole lot about sort of like, you know, yes, there are things we can be doing on a community level, like the community gardens, like the allotments. We've done, when we were able to meet together, things where we would, local community, you know, you'd get 8 families together and they'd all cook and eat together and have something to take home as well, because there's a social aspect to all this that's really important, as to which you were saying, the community aspect. But there is something about how food is distributed and where it's available that also adds to this for the families that we work with.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think I was looking up at data about food deserts in the UK and especially Scotland. I think one of the big like food deserts is located like around Glasgow. So I think that was quite a shock to me to learn about this. But yeah, what do you think moving forward? I think that's going to be my last question before we open up to the Q&A. How should we remedy, I guess, to like food deserts in general? Especially like as you're like in Glasgow, I think, because it's such a big thing. And like as you said, like maybe community gardens are like a small drop in the ocean. Maybe how do we get access to better food, basically? Because I know, for example, there's been a Good Food Nation bill or the right to food that's been trying to be implemented, but it's been taken back because of COVID. And I guess my question is, maybe is this part of the green recovery for you? Is this kind of like where the answer lies?
I know that the Glasgow Community Food Network has been doing research around that, particularly in terms of mapping where the current food distribution places are, but also looking at what is missing. I think that was going to be an interesting learning opportunity for us to see what best can be done to address this. I know that pre-COVID, there had been other community initiatives where where I live, they used to say, come and dine with me at that particular time of the month. And those people who could afford to do something would make a donation, and the food would be made in a big community center, and we all gathered together and identified other things that needed to be done. I think the community is very resilient in terms of coming up with alternatives to some of these issues. Why it's challenging really is addressing the structural issues that Sartrat and I talked about earlier. But, you know, the community is always willing to do things differently. The whole question, as I said, you know, tackling food waste through the food share initiatives that are there would be a good way to go in terms of going forward. But fundamentally, I think the ideal position we all want to see is a situation where each and every individual is able to put food on their table within their budget and according to the choice or that they really want, the food that they want to eat, as long as it's healthy and helpful to them. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing to that. And as part of the Social Renewal Advisory Board, food security and access to food has been one of the areas that we've looked at. I wasn't involved in that particular policy circle. They had a whole series of circles, including those with direct experience being at the heart of it, so that we are developing solutions identified as solutions by those directly affected, as opposed to thinking that we know the answers based on our own limited experience and things like that. And so it'll be interesting to see how far that work progresses and whether we actually do look at how we build back fairer and something that's more just and equal, as opposed to just going back to the way we used to do things, which is always my fear, that we're going to revert back to the old way because it's the way we know, as opposed to thinking about this. So I suppose the thing is to look out for these things as they come out and to respond and challenge them if they're not being radical enough in terms of the solutions being proposed. Because it is like, you know, one of these moments, one of the things I said was that at the moment it's the COVID crisis, but there's going to be a series of shocks and crises, and what we have to do is, you know, I mean, Brexit, I'm sorry, let's not even talk about the 1st of January and what's going to happen after that, you know. And then the climate crisis is going to cause further crises. And if we're wanting something where the shock is not felt this unequally, we need to learn from this big global shock we've had in terms of how we build something that's going to allow us all to absorb these shocks equally and not have the burden fall on some more than others.
Mhm. Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's quite important as well to look at how all these crises interrelate as well. So, for example, like COVID, like health crisis, and then the climate crisis, and who is most vulnerable as well. So, yeah, that's totally a good point. Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop sharing, and then we'll see if people have questions in the audience.
Have we stunned you all into silence?
I think, okay, I do. Yeah, there is one question. Yeah, what are your thoughts in general on the right to food, like the idea that it should be incorporated into Scots like domestic law, and do you think that would be effective?
Well, I know that I've facilitated the conversation on human rights law that is being considered in Scotland as part of the Human Rights Consortium. And of course, the right to food is one of the fundamental human rights that we should all have. But that right can only be enforced when the structural issues that Satwat and I spoke about earlier again, because you can't have that right unless you have the means to actually enforce it. And I think the other thing that we said needs to be taken into account as that law is being considered is to make sure that there are checks and balances that can be included in that, and in the event that that right is breached, that there are approaches for redress. One of the things that have made human rights as conventions, as entitlements ineffective is the fact that it's difficult to claim them, and even if it's wrong and you can prove it, you have almost nowhere to go to challenge it. So if it's not challengeable, if it's not enforceable, then we'll fall into the same category of having a very beautiful, well written out document by the legal jargon, but means nothing to ordinary person like me and you who are struggling on the ground.
I would agree.
Yeah, I think you're on mute, sorry.
Sorry, I would agree. I've just put into the chat bar a link to Together Scotland's page on the UNCRC, because the Scottish government has agreed to incorporate the UNCRC into Scots law. But as Chimuchi says, there is always a gap between that sort of legislation, policy, intent and practice. So actually what's as important is if you're going to be having the UNCRC incorporated, and that right to food and all those basic rights are in there for children. If you're going to be looking at having laws around certain things, you have to make sure that you resource what's required in order to make those real for people. Because I mean, we have a Child Poverty Act. We have targets in Scotland that we're going to end child poverty by 2030. We've got interim targets that by 2023, we're going to reduce the number living in poverty to 18%, you know, from the figures that we've got at the moment. What we're not seeing is the redistribution of wealth that's required in order to make that happen. So you can have the legislative frameworks, and what they're useful for is to try to hold people to account and to challenge. And I'm hoping under the UNCRC incorporation, there will be legal challenges that could then be launched if things weren't happening, but it's not enough on its own, is what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a good point. There's a question from Lucy asking, what can university students specifically, what can they do to help combat children's food insecurity, either small everyday changes or more system-based, larger scale things?
That's a very good question. I would be really interested to know what your universities do and whether there's anything you can do there around what your universities do, how much food wastage there is amongst the universities, you know, how they can support twin with places, etc. locally, what sort of community actions and activities they would get involved in. So I would always argue that you put pressure on your own institution first to see what they're doing and how they can adapt and do more, and then look beyond that. Because I mean, you know, and also they're incredibly large employers. Most of these universities are across Scotland. And whilst I'm hoping they're all living wage employers, you know, there's an awful lot of staff contracted in to run services. Are they ensuring that that living wage is passed down and the living hours are passed down? So I would say, look at the practices of the institutions where you are students at the moment and use that as the starting point, because that, I think that would be incredibly challenging and powerful to do.
Yeah, I think also part of the conversation is really broadening the conversation beyond the few students, so that there is that debate, you know, to highlight the unfairness and the injustices that exist in our country, in terms of such a rich country with so many, you know, people who are able to make sure that we can have a fair and equal society. So be part of that conversation that demand a fair distribution of resources, I think would be a good one. And if there are any campaigns going around, support them. A lot of work now is done online as well. So look out to find out, keep an eye on our website, for example, and see if there is anything out there that you might be interested in being part of. But also be part of the community initiatives that are going around. You know, one of my daughters used to volunteer when she was still at university. She used to volunteer to, the university had a soup kitchen itself, and they would go on the streets as university students and feed the homeless. You might think that is a small act of kindness, but it makes a huge difference to that person who was going to sleep hungry that night. So I would encourage them to, you know, see what are the community initiatives around there. The Grass Market in Edinburgh is one of the well-known organizations that does things like that. I would encourage students to go out there and see what they could do to help and volunteer their time as well.
Mm-hmm. And actually following on to that, there's a question by Olivia about there's the fact that there are discussions maybe about abolishing food banks, and do you think that's a good idea for families on lower income, such as asylum seekers who have no right to access benefits?
I didn't know that there were discussions about abolishing food banks. I think certainly ourselves and even the likes of the Trussell Trust, who, as you know, are one of the biggest organisers of food banks, have said that they would rather a society where there was no need for them. Mm-hmm. And that what they want to do is work themselves out of the need for food banks. I don't think it would be something that one could abolish, because it's not like they've been set up in statute. Mm-hmm. You know, people do it because they want to all over the place. And whilst the Trussell Trust has its own network, lots of places do it. Community organisations do it, churches do it, mosques do it, gurdwaras do it, lots of religious places do it and stuff like that. I don't think it's so much that we'd want to abolish them, because we know there's a need for them at the moment. We would certainly want to abolish the need for them. And I would ideally want it so that asylum seekers would have a right to access to benefits and wouldn't be have the no recourse to public funds rule applied to them. So no, I can't see that happening.
Yeah.
I can't see what. There was another question, sorry, just about larger families, which I just saw. I think it was Julian asked that, and I just thought that was really interesting, Julian, given what Tamuchi had said earlier about the fact that we have a UK government that actively sets out to punish you if you have more than 2 children under the benefit system. So I couldn't imagine at UK level there being some sort of financial and transport benefits given to larger families. But I do know larger families are one of the priority groups within the Child Poverty Act, because they recognise that there is a greater risk of poverty amongst families who've got a larger number of children. So I think it's worth looking to see what we could do there. And the other thing I will say about transport is there is a consultation out at the moment. I'm hoping it's not closed yet, which was on making public transport free to children and young people up to the age of 19 in Scotland, which I think would go a big way to answering that question.
Yeah, for sure. I might have a last question actually. Do you think there's enough awareness about food security in general, and especially regarding to children? Do you know what is being done right, or maybe from your experiences, and then what more can be done in the future?
Okay, if I may respond, I think there is some level of awareness, especially at community level, that some families are really struggling to put food on the table. And this has been heightened even more during the pandemic. And I think I'm glad that Scottish government, local authorities, foundations put a lot of resources, made a lot of resources available for emergency food intervention. That is in recognition that yes, there is a challenge, there is a problem. What is missing is finding the long-term solution, because you can deal with an emergency now, but when we come out of it, we have to have a more permanent approach on how that is going to be changed. And it goes back to what we were talking about, changing the policy shift to make sure that each and everyone has enough money to put food on the table. The schools, the education system know that. They know the children who come to school hungry. And teachers sometimes have had to put on a snack during break time to make sure that the children can concentrate. One of the things we have to remember that as long as our children are kept hungry, that will impact on their education attainment and any final destination that they may aspire to. So the impact is not now in terms of the hunger, it's about the long-term impact that has. And that long-term impact is not only going to be felt by that person or that young person, it's going to be felt by all of us in a way. Societies, successful societies, they say, are judged by how fair they treat the vulnerable people in their community. And we
absolutely, yeah,
to make sure that
absolutely.
Maybe is fair and looked after.
And the only two things I would add to that is I think there is more awareness now, and I think that's in a large part due to Marcus Rashford and the work that he's done. And there's the power of a story in a way, isn't there? Yeah. Here is somebody who remembers what it was like to feel hungry, who knows how important that food at school was, and who's taken the position he's found himself in and the influence and the profile that gives him to raise an issue that's very, very important to him. And he's dogged in it. He's not going to let go of this, you know. And actually, he's got nothing to lose in terms of he can shame who he likes, and he is. So in some ways, I think it's quite remarkable what he's done. And it's really interesting now to see how his thinking is beginning to shift to cash for families and other things as well, you know. But there's also a simplicity in that message of end child food hunger, end child food poverty. Yeah. You know, it's something lots of us feel, but he's managed to reach probably change public attitude in a way that those of us who are activists haven't been able to, simply because of one, he's got the experience, two, the power of the story, and three, the position and the profile he's got. So yes, there probably is more, but I do think there's a little bit of watch this space, because there's a lot of vested corporate interests in the way things work, as we know. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a system that we live in that's based on profit. And we need to think about the interplay between all those things when we're talking about this. But no, I think the work he's done, as someone has just put in the chat, is amazing, and he's not letting go. And is, you know, some of the things he says, I think there's something about that. He's a very good wordsmith as well, and he speaks from the heart. So when he said, as long as these children do not have a voice, they will have mine. Yeah. You know, as a mum, that goes right here. because I'd want someone to always be fighting for my kids if I wasn't around to do it and stuff. So I think that's hugely important. But I think everyone's, people who've worked in communities, in schools, in these communities, etc., as Tumuchi says, have known about this and the impact it has on children. I mean, when I lived in Hackney in London, my kids went to the closest school around the corner, when I would say probably about 40% of the kids were asylum-seeking refugees, etc., stuff like that. It was without, nobody questioned the fact that in every class, every morning, there would be fruit and toast for every child if they wanted it. And the same throughout the day and the same at the end of the day. And it wasn't about, this is only for those kids who are on free school meals or anything like that. It was just there in the class, a event for kids to pick up and eat as and when they wanted to. There was no stigma and it was universal. And I think that's what's key when we're looking at some of this, access to food is a right. And we need to ensure it's a right for everyone in a way that doesn't make them feel inadequate or make others think that they're inadequate in some way.
And I can only add on a small bit about mothers, really. I'm biased here because I'm a mother. I'm a mother of 5 and a grandmother of 2. So you can imagine that I speak from a very personal journey as well. When there is that food shortage, it's the mothers, as Swat had said earlier, they would rather go without to ensure that the children eat. But we have to understand it in the sense of the impact it has on the mothers who are the shock absorbers of food poverty, on the mothers who are having sleepless nights because they are not so sure what their children are going to eat tomorrow. And as a country, we have a duty to make sure that, people who are responsible for raising children, whether they are mothers or fathers or carers, have the support they need in order to be able to support the children.
Yes, thank you for sharing this. This is quite an important part to take into account as well, like the mothers. So I think we're done with questions as well, and we're going to end this event. Thank you for sharing your story. It's been really insightful, and I really like both of your perspective. It was really useful. And it's nice to know about all the structural inequalities and also the different aspects and how they interrelate. So it's been really, really insightful. And thank you for being here with us tonight. And thank you for everyone else for joining as well. Yes, so I think we're gonna end it here. If you guys want to